This image is often in my mind, and I think it dates back to my family therapy training, so I need to acknowledge our place in that. They talked about systemic therapy being like if you had the image of a city in your mind where there's a tall or skyscraper or two, but then if you look at the whole city, there's a map going out to the suburbs and there's gardens and parks and lots of roads. And they talked about therapists often making the mistake of focusing on the most visible thing, which might be the two skyscrapers in the middle of town because they stick out. But really, to know the city, you've got to drive around lots and lots of the roads and the little by lanes and stop in the park and the garden and, you know, sort of explore the back streets as well as focusing on the most obvious issue, which may be the problem that's brought the family to see you.
Do you share that with the family, or is that more
No, it's
informing
in my
your
mind,
thinking?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so what I do is I deliberately try to look at other things, and we start by doing a genogram always and just exploring relationships in the family and going wider rather than... And I actually do say, look, let's talk about what brought you here a bit later. I'd just like to understand how it works in your family first. Mm-hmm. So I sort of have this visual image of going around and just exploring the town, really.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's kind of like getting to know the territory of the problem, isn't it? So there's the problem which is front and centre for the family, and you're wanting to explore the surroundings to understand what is the environment.
Exactly, and also immediately to start looking at some of the strengths or the warmth or things that join them together and how they're connected with each other, rather than just looking at the problem and you know, zeroing in on. And you can see them relaxing and actually like noticing things that they hadn't really thought about since this problem started bothering them. I often will ask older children to help me with it. And we'll put up the basics and make the joke about, you know, squares for guys and circles for women. And and then once we've got the outline, I ask the kids to choose a colour for different feelings or emotions or interactions in the family, like what shall we use for anger or fighting, what colour shall we use for being close to people. And then I ask them to put connecting lines on the whiteboard to show, you know, who they're closest to, who they fight with, and then we can get a lot of information out about, you know, well, what about mum and dad? Do they fight, or mum and stepdad? And it comes out quite naturally and in a non-blaming way, and parents sometimes get to hear things that they maybe didn't think they were going to be open about, but the kids have brought it into the room already. So that's how I use it, and it gets them up and gets them engaged. Yes.
And I think having it up on the whiteboard and, you know, it's up there, it's visible for everyone to see, and you can continue to refer to those relationships and the things that have been talked about, the genogram, as you explore the problem and the patterns in the family.
It's almost like the map then around, you know, so you've got a map of this town in your head and you've also got the map of the genogram, and then you can go back through time as well if you want.
And I've had a number of families, parents really say to me, gosh, you know, now I never realised that was a repeating pattern in our family, fathers leaving early or, you know, at what age they left home. And it helps, I think having it up there on the whiteboard as a visual thing for people to see helps them hold it in mind and reflect on those bigger patterns as well.
Absolutely.
So it's really useful.
You know, that there's been daughters who died early, or babies that were lost in each generation, or just the sort of pain that people carry across the generations that then impacts on how they relate to the next generation, and if they're extra anxious about their sons or their daughters, or or violence is a pattern. Or
stories about, you know, mothers being sidelined, or there being very strong relationships between fathers and daughters in this family's, you know, history through the generations, and that, you know, what are they doing similar or different to.
It's quite fun to track the black sheep in the family too. There's often, you know, an uncle out on the side, and the teenager really looks up to that person, and then you look back and you see it was the time before, or a rebel, or
Similar to Robin, I don't necessarily explicitly talk about with families, but it helps me think about exploring things. And so I sort of have an image of a tree in my head, and that when a family comes in and they're talking about a particular problem or issue, they're really focusing on like one branch of the tree. And it's almost like that's in the spotlight, and the rest of the tree is in darkness. So I see my job as to help the family explore the other branches of the trees and take it off in what might seem like unusual directions, but is actually all connected to the main trunk, and it's connected and related. But by exploring those different pathways and helping turn the family's attention towards that, they start to be able to see a different way of looking at their problems and different options and opportunities for change and doing things differently. So I also kind of have that tree image in my head as well when I'm thinking, you know, there's an obvious question to ask a family in response to something that they're saying, but there will also be at least 3 or 4 other pathways I can take.
Yes.
And so if I'm running into a dead end, that's okay. I just sort of come back to, you know, the last junction and see if I can take it in a different direction to explore
I really
things.
like that, and that's where the street metaphor works for me too. Like, don't get stuck in dead ends, or don't get stuck at the bottom of your skyscraper. You know, there's always other paths to go. And I love the tree image. I mean, I'm going to use that now.
Yeah.
Because immediately I start thinking about the strength of the trunk, or how strong it is, and also the roots, and again that going back in time, and the values that nourish a family, and
how you can also use it as the tree as the, you know, part of the family that you're dealing with, and then the roots as the history and going back through the generations. And if you kind of look at that image, you see how the root system of a tree really mirrors the canopy of a tree, and how, you know, we can look at those patterns and compare and think about that. One that I often explicitly talk about with families, so I use an image of a spider web really to represent how everything is interconnected. I often will draw the spider web up on the board and pick family members to put at the nodes, you know, where the bits of the spider web connect. I'll usually put the child in the centre, because they're coming to our service because they're worried about what's happening for their child or struggling to manage things. You know, and then around that I'll put the siblings and the parents, then I'll add the school and more distant relatives and that sort of stuff. So you can kind of put some of the system on the spider web. And I say, look, if I picked this part of the spider web, and I picked the child and pulled it, what would happen to the other parts of the spider web? And they would all move. And the bits closest would move more, and the bits further away would move less, but they would all move. And so it's a way I have of using that metaphor to help families understand why I'm asking about all these other things, not just focusing on the child. And I also find it quite helpful when maybe they're feeling like the child isn't willing to change, but I'm saying it's okay, even if your child doesn't do anything differently, if I help you do something differently, that is going to help your child move. So it's a way of talking about how we can work with different parts of the system, and then the connections between them will help change happen.
And I love that, and I use that explicitly too at times, because I think it really does help you engage parents or sometimes siblings in, well, if we can get something different happening, then it will all change. Because it can't not. And I also use that quite explicitly at times. So,
and you can say
you can get parents on side a lot more then, because they're like, why are you getting me to change? You know, I've come here for my child. And then, you know, if you can say, well, actually, you're the one that's most motivated for change. Why would they suddenly want to start going to school? It's actually quite nice for them at home, you know. So if we can get you changing something, then that will change their world too.
Help them reposition themselves and do things differently. And it's also, if you want to move the whole spider web, it's going to be easier if we've got 3 bits of it moving rather than just one. So you can say this is a project for the whole family, or whoever else wants to be involved in it as well, you know, getting the school on board. And CAMS is part of the spider web as well, and cultural beliefs are part of the spider web. Like all these things have an influence, and some are more strongly anchored than others, and some are a bit more manoeuvrable than others. So
and some need anchoring, you know,
Yes.
and they're waving in the wind, and they actually do need to be connected back to the fence post or whatever. So,
and while, you know, I talk about that explicitly with families, it's also helpful for our own thinking as therapists around that issue of who or what part of the system is most manoeuvrable, where are we most likely to get some change happening, and so we don't have to, you know, just focus on one part of the system. We need to have that bigger view and looking at where can we get some change happening.
in therapy generally, whatever model you're using, family systems theory has named it as neutrality, which might sound like you're being neutral about things like violence, which you're not. But neutrality, another word for it is even-handedness. So what you want is everybody in the room, or even the people that are only present in the room because somebody's talking about them, you want them to feel evenly heard and their perspectives heard, so that they don't feel like you're on the side of the child or you're on the side of the parent or you're blaming someone. So it's really another way of talking about non-judgment, but in a dynamic way that respects all of them on the nodes of the web, really, so that they don't feel like, well, they're the problem. And I mean, usually children come to us with parents sort of blaming them in some way, or maybe parents come blaming themselves. That's often the other thing, and they come prepared to be blamed but also trying to protect themselves about that. And so the neutrality and non-judgment, even-handed treatment of everybody's ideas in the room and making space for that. If the child has not got a voice and the parent is dominating the session, finding some ways to say, well, I wonder what Johnny thinks about this. Maybe shall we ask him, or what do you think he thinks about this? And then, you know, so circular questioning comes into that too.
I think there's kind of multiple strands of thinking about neutrality, and which I think you've touched on all of them, but I might just speak to it a little bit more. As a therapist, you are wanting, as you say, to make sure that everybody feels heard in the family, and sometimes it doesn't necessarily mean giving everybody equal airtime. Sometimes we are seeking to establish a bit more of a balance in the family, so we might amplify someone's unheard voice a bit more than someone who's tending to dominate the conversation. But in doing that, we still need to remain, you know, neutral with that dominant person, respecting their contribution and making them feel heard. I think it can be quite a tricky thing to do sometimes. At the end of the session, if you were to ask the family, whose side did I take, you want them all to say mine or no one's, you know, like everyone's equally. Yeah. I think, as you said, Robin, often the family coming with the child being scapegoated, one thing that we can often fall into as CAMHS clinicians is then actually us internally scapegoating the parents a little bit.
Yes.
So we need to be mindful of our biases as well and have an awareness of them and hold them in mind and not let them kind of influence how we're reacting to the family. So we have to be aware of how we're feeling and not kind of fall into that trap of scapegoating
Exactly.
people.
And what I have noticed from supervising for a long time is that when we have young clinicians come in, maybe before they have their own children, or when they're younger, they can often tend to get drawn to sticking up for the child in the session and trying to explain them to their parents or something. And then as they get older, like me, maybe, and they've gone through the parenting thing, sometimes there'll be a lot of sympathy towards, based on their own experiences towards a parent and how difficult it is. You know, we can be thinking, oh, that kid really is a real problem. And so we do need to just take notice of our own biases, and if we feel ourselves being drawn into that sort of trying to explain someone to somebody else and advocating for a position, we really need to work with that in supervision and also sit back from it and think, how can I even this up? They'll think I'm on this person's side or that person's side. As soon as you take sides, you get resistance and defence and people pushing against you.
Taking that stance of curiosity and opening up your thinking, a helpful question I find to ask myself is, in what context does this person's behaviour, attitude, approach make sense? And making sense doesn't mean that I have to agree with it or share those values, but finding a way to really understand why it's logical for this person to be behaving in this way or responding in this way. And if I don't have a good sense of that, then I need to ask more questions to help me uncover that.
So you can understand it, so
Yes.
you can be empathic with how that happens,
Yeah.
even though you may personally be quite disapproving that it happens, but that's
Yes.
not the issue. It's about trying to understand it so
Yeah.
that shift is possible.
Yes. And I think holding in mind that people are generally doing the very best they can with what they have, and they usually have positive intentions. So if we can understand their positive intentions, what might be informing their behaviour, then we can help them think about it and have choices to do things differently. But if we get stuck in judging them, we're not really opening up new conversations. So they're probably doing the best they can and they have positive intentions. How do I understand it? And this behaviour that looks ridiculous, crazy, stupid, unhelpful to me on the surface, really, where are they coming from and what is going through their mind? What beliefs are underpinning that, what patterns, what history that help me understand why they're making those choices, because they're probably not doing it to create problems.